Before listening to this sermon, can you please read 1 Peter chapter 5 verses 5 to 14? Should be some links below this video. So today we're going to look firstly at the request of a father. If you were to tell someone about the worst thing that's happening to you at the moment, what would be your opening line? After spending half an hour telling them about your pain and frustration, how would you end? My guess is that many of us would begin by saying, I know there's people who are worse off than me, but... And my guess is that many of us would end by saying, still, I know there are people who are worse off. Are these words true? Yes. Are these words biblical? Well, I would say no. Yes, there may be other people who experience more pain and frustration, but this does not mean that God doesn't care about yours. Yes, several billion others in the world may be suffering, but that does not mean your experience in life is any the less real. Instead, Peter calls us in these verses to cast all our anxiety on God because he cares for you. God cares about the things that cause you anxiety and the things that cause you to feel pain and frustration. It doesn't matter how big or little they are. Just go with me on this and just think about it. After suffering a car crash, would an orthopedic surgeon refuse to operate because you'd only broken 1 out of 4 limbs? Would the surgeon send you home and tell you to come back in 3 car crashes' time? If you asked for pain relief, would they ask you to hit someone else 12 times on the head with a frying pan on the way out? After all, if they're hurting more, then you should hurt less, right? No, wrong. The fact that others are hurting does not make your pain meaningless and trivial. Nor do you have to justify why God should care about your problems over and above somebody else's. Instead, you and I can cast all our anxieties on Him. Why? Because He cares for you. If you are a Christian, God is your heavenly Father, and His request to you is that you share with Him every anxiety and concern that you have. That is what the life of faith is all about, looking to God in our weakness. But how are believers in difficult circumstances to know God's care? After all, the suffering Peter's audience were going through would likely cause them to question God's goodness. Maybe personal suffering, or simply the presence of suffering in the world, has caused you to doubt God's care as well. Does God always show His care through immediate rescue? Or does God show His care by giving His people the supernatural strength to cope? Perhaps God's care is communicated by Him causing God incidences to happen that remind us of His providential provision. How does Peter prove to us that, like verse 7 says, God cares? Well, this brings us to our second point, the reminder of God's Son. We can know God cares because of the reminder of God's Son. Peter knows more than anyone else that the experiences of believers differ. That's why in chapter 1 he describes believers as experiencing all kinds of trials. Peter had himself been dramatically rescued from persecution and imprisonment. But Peter had also seen Stephen stoned to death and James beheaded. Peter had seen Paul, the unstoppable force empowered by God to speak the gospel boldly. But Paul also wrote letters describing himself as feeling burdened beyond his own strength. Peter, as an apostle, saw God perform miracles, and yet Paul, a fellow apostle, also described times when his prayers to God went unanswered. Peter reminds his readers of God's mighty hand in verse 6, a term that refers back to the Israelites' dramatic exodus from Egypt, when God worked his mighty hand on their behalf. And yet Peter also knew that God's mighty hand left Israel in Egypt 400 years before that moment, God quietly working in seemingly less dramatic ways. In other words, the experiences of Christians differ. We experience all kinds of trials, and we may experience varying amounts of we might think that we experience varying amounts of God's help. So how can we, whose experiences in life differ, be certain of God's care? How can we obey verse 6 and humbly trust God's fatherly care, even when stuck in circumstances that might cause us to doubt? Well, in this letter, Peter repeatedly points us back to Jesus. Firstly, reminding us in chapter 1 that God sent Jesus to shed his precious blood on our behalf. Chapter 1, verse 19. If you need proof that God cares, remind yourself of the way God has already demonstrated it. Jesus shed his precious blood on our behalf. A modern hymn by City Alight puts it so well. What great gift of grace is Jesus my Redeemer. There is no more for heaven now to give. God gave us his everything, his one and only Son, because he cared. So though yes, you might as a human question his wisdom at times, you cannot question God's care and compassion. Not only this, but repeatedly reminds us that Christ also experienced much the same, if not more suffering than you and I. We read in chapter 3, verse 18, that Christ also suffered. Christ also experienced times of weakness. Christ also had his Gethsemane prayer for immediate rescue go unanswered, though he was submissive and was willing to accept whatever answer God gave. Christ also experienced circumstances that would cause him to cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So when Peter calls you and I in verse 6 to humble ourselves under God's mighty hand, Peter is calling us to humbly follow the example of Christ, the Son who entrusted himself to his Father at all times. As it says in chapter 2, verse 23, Christ entrusted himself to God. Chapter 2, verse 23, Christ entrusted himself to God, leaving his future in God's hands, trusting God's wisdom, looking to God to provide for him, believing God's promises. And what was the result? Well, at the right time and in a glorious way, God fulfilled his promises, raising Christ from the grave and answering Christ's cries for rescue and relief. And with the example of Jesus in mind, God requests you and I to do the same. Verse 6. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. God calls you and I to be like Jesus, someone who trusted his Father throughout his earthly journey of suffering. This will involve humility from you and me, trusting God's wisdom. This will involve trusting God's provision in whatever the future holds. This will involve faith in God's promise that our temporary suffering will one day be followed by eternal relief. So that's the request of our Father, the reminder of the Son, and now thirdly, the roar of an outlaw. Verse 8. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy the devil prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Marriage is a package deal. You not only get a spouse, you also inherit the in-laws. Sometimes this part of the package is unwanted. Likewise, when God is your father, you also inherit an enemy called the devil, an unwanted outlaw, that opposes every believer till the day that they die. But what kind of opposition can you expect? In verse 6, Peter speaks of God's mighty hand, whereas in verse 8 he speaks of the roaring of the devil. This first truth is meant to reassure believers that God's mighty hand is in full control of their lives, whereas the main threat of the devil comes through the roar of his voice. You know, a can of baked beans falling onto your head is not an attack of the devil, but his voice can probably fill your head with the wrong types of thoughts afterwards. Bad circumstances are not directly sent by the devil to beat believers up, but the devil can certainly use bad circumstances to wage war on the believer's mind, perhaps causing them to question God's goodness, or think negatively about God, or about life, or even negatively about themselves. The devil doesn't have the authority to throw suffering in a believer's direction, but, as the father of lies, he will use suffering to amplify his lies and discredit the truth. So it is not suffering in itself that is the greatest threat to the believer. In fact, many believers have grown in faith through going through difficulty. You'll probably even be able to name Christians who have demonstrated great faith in the worst of circumstances. Sadly, you'll probably also know of others who have given up their faith because of less. The physical side of suffering, though significant, is not the greatest threat to the believer. Instead, the greatest threat is to the believer's mind. For this reason, Peter urges us to be alert and of sober mind in verse 8. Be alert and of sober mind. We need to be alert, watching out for things like bitterness, discouragement, and hopelessness, things that can so easily wear us down if we let them. We need to guard our mind, not letting suffering lead us towards the type of doubt or despair that might cripple us, gradually eroding away our faith in God. So, do you see the devil like an outlaw? You know, in ancient England, an outlaw was someone so rebellious that they were stripped of all legal protection. No jury had to listen to them. No lawyer was required to support them. No questions were asked of any citizen who killed the outlaw in cold blood. And yet, so often, we listen to our own thoughts, even when they contradict God's truth. So often we support the lies of the devil by letting them run around our head. So often we entertain bitterness, despair, doubts, and the like, rather than putting such thoughts to death. Peter calls us to regard the devil as an outlaw, like that one-eyed outlaw in a Western film, who walks with a limp, curses with every breath, and drinks the blood of innocent hamsters at the local bar. You know, in the Wild West, you don't let that type of outlaw into your saloon. So don't let that type of outlaw into your mind. Instead, we need to resist the lies of the devil, resisting the thoughts and arguments that lead us towards discouragement and doubt. As it says in verse 9, resisting him by standing firm in the faith. In other words, we need to be answering the lies of the devil with God's truth. What convinces you that God is good despite suffering? What promises do you cling to when you are discouraged? What truths do you fight back with when certain thoughts run around your head? You and I all need to have answers ready for these types of questions. Otherwise, when our faith is tested, our own thoughts, mixed with the lies of the devil, will drag us down. Which leads us to, fourthly and finally, the role of God's family. If you have God as a friend, you automatically have the devil as an enemy. But if you have the devil as an enemy, you also have a million others throughout the world as your friends. For as Peter reminds us in verse 9, believers are all of the same family. Believers are all in the same battle together. Verse 9, resist him, that is the devil. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings. In one sense, believers face all kinds of trials. The shape, size, and severity of trials differ between one believer and another. In one sense, believers face different trials, but in another sense, the trials believers face are the same. Doubts, despair, discouragement, the appeal of compromise, the pull towards bitterness and negativity. All of these things are common to believers, even if the circumstances they are in might be different. Whatever the silent thought that wears you down is, chances are that there are a million others battling the same thought as well. That is why the Christian community should be a place where we share these things, rather than a place where we hide these things by pretending we have it all together. Perhaps the most helpful thing you can do this week is to tell another Christian not only what is going on in your life, but also what is going on in your mind. Chances are they'll be relieved that someone else is battling the same doubts and discouragement that they are. Chances are you'll be able to encourage each other as well. Christians face the same battle, and so we all have a role in helping someone else. It's for reasons like these that, after explaining all these theological truths, Peter ends on a very practical note. Verse 13, she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends her greetings, and so does my son Mark. Peter tells those he was writing to that another church, she who is in Babylon, says hello. Peter tells his readers that she who is in Babylon says hello. Peter describes this church as in Babylon, not because of its geographical location. Babylon no longer existed as a place. Instead, Peter describes the church as in Babylon, because Babylon was the place of Old Testament Israel's exile. God's Old Testament people, Israel, spent their years in Babylon together, suffering together as a community of exiles as they awaited their return to the Promised Land. Likewise, New Testament believers find themselves in the same situation, finding ourselves in an ungodly world as a community of exiles who await their Promised Land. Do you say hello to other Christians on a regular basis? Do you spend time sharing what you and they are going through? Do you only care about your own suffering? Or do you care about the suffering of the family of believers throughout the world? The hellos, the encouragements, the prayers of other believers is what keeps many believers around the world going. For all Christians face the same battle, and so we all have a role in encouraging someone else. So in summary, the request of a father: cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. The reminder of God's Son: when we doubt, Jesus is the proof of God's care for us. Jesus is the example of a humble trust. Jesus is the perfect example of humble trust. Thirdly, the roar of an outlaw. The devil is the father of lies, who we are to resist with God's truth. And fourthly, the role of God's family. Because we are all in the same battle, we all have a role in encouraging someone else.